Thank you for joining us for our 2:30 p.m. Small Areas Habitat panel. For our speakers, we have Laurie Scott, who's the lab coordinator and environmental science land manager at the Northwest Arkansas Community College, and she also coordinates for the Outdoor Living Laboratory. And then we also have one of our previous speakers, Eric Fuselier, and he is the environmental project manager. And we also have Dr. Janet Lanza joining us. She is the professor emeritus at University of Arkansas Little Rock and is the co-coordinator for Arkansas Wild Spaces. So I'd like to thank our speakers, and if you could unmute yourselves, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, go ahead while I load up the questions.
You want to start, Laurie?
I can. Hi, my name's Laurie Scott. I am a lab coordinator here at Northwest Arkansas Community College, and I am the land manager for a 16-acre outdoor living laboratory that we have on campus, where we give our students opportunities for undergraduate research in brand new entry-level biology classes that might just look like a project that runs for the entire semester. But there's lots of stuff going on out there, especially in the realm of pollinators. So we're super excited to be here today and hope we can share some of what we've learned.
I'll make mine brief since I've already introduced myself, but I'm Eric Fuselier. I'm an environmental project manager at Craft and Toll, which is a civil engineering firm. There we design rain gardens, detention ponds, bioswales, that sort of thing that go along with our projects. I'm also involved with various native plant related organizations in Arkansas.
And I'm Janet Lanza, retired ecology professor from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And Lynn Foster and Lynn is a recently retired law school professor. She and I are starting a program called the Arkansas Wild Spaces that we hope will be able to help residential homeowners decide what kinds of native plants to put in their yards and the reason for doing it. I'm also the incoming president-elect of the Central Arkansas Master Naturalists.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for agreeing to be a part of this panel. I'd like to remind everyone that if you have any questions for our panelists, either on Zoom or Facebook, you can type it into the questions box. To get us started, let's see, we have a couple questions that were emailed to us. So do you have any favorite native plant species that you enjoy working with more than others? I know it's super hard to narrow it down, but if you could pick either 2 or 3 species that you'd like to just quickly mention, we can move on to the next question.
I'll go first. I went first when we did introductions. I really like working with milkweed, and I know that seems sort of cliche and obvious, but when I started working with native plants 7, 8 years ago, there wasn't a good idea of how to get milkweed to go, how to get it to germinate, and maybe we could get one to go, but that protocol didn't necessarily work all the way across the board. So through trial and error and what started out as lots of playing, we've got a pretty good idea of how to get a lot of milkweed to go from seed all the way through its life cycle and get it to reseed again. So that's one of my personal favorites, but I don't think that there are any plants that I dislike terribly.
I'd like to add to that just to the coneflowers. I really like the echinaceas. There's a lot of variety with them. You can get Echinacea paradoxa, which is a yellow variety of coneflower. Or I say variety, yellow species of coneflower. The paradox is that it's yellow and not purple.
And I think that's maybe the toughest question you're going to ask me all day. How can I pick just one? But I like baptisias. They come in a variety of colors: white, blue, yellow. Those are great. They've been good for me to plant. The other one that I find amazing is cup plants, Silphium perfoliatum, I guess. And in my garden, which is mostly compost, so it's very rich soil, they get 10 feet tall. They're great. The goldfinches love them too.
Awesome, thank you all. So how critical is it to have small pollinator plots, either in backyard gardens or community plantings, for moving insects?
I think one isolated plot doesn't do a lot, but it's better than nothing. I also think if you start a pollinator plot, that you might encourage your neighbors, in which case maybe then you'll have 2, and maybe then you'll have 4, and it can grow slowly, or maybe like COVID recently, it can grow exponentially. That would be great. So I think it's much better than nothing. And I do think people need to start small, because if you try and do the whole yard all at once, it's going to be a mess and time consuming, and you're going to give up. So start small, and let's just do 1 yard at a time.
I'd like to echo what Janet said. Starting small is the best way to go. I recently moved, so I'm 18 months in a house that is literally in the middle of the forest and the woods that had primarily cultivated beds around it. So research is showing that being a native plant purist is not necessarily the best choice if we're looking at nectar sources. So I did not take out all the cultivars that I had. What I have is about a 90-10 mix in my beds that were already established. Then I had some ironweed just come up in the middle of the yard. And rather than move the ironweed out of the yard into the garden bed, what we started doing, we're moving other native plants that came up in the garden bed that had flushed out and spread this last spring, and making a second pollinator bed out around the one single native plant in the only part of the yard that we actually mow. So starting small is absolutely the best way to go, and to keep it manageable while you're learning.
And before you jump in, Eric, really fast, someone asked if we could define the size for a, quote, small area. Is this a yard or several acres? I would almost argue it depends on how formal you are, but I'll let you take it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's definitely a difference between landscape scale and then, small home garden scale. I don't know that we have a cutoff for when you get from one to the other, but I just feel like, yeah, if there's an area that is not its natural habitat, whether it's been turned into a lawn or turned into anything else, and just replacing these native plants, it's going to help mitigate some of that impact to the food for local pollinators.
I think scale is very very fuzzy term. I think people who have patio homes in the outer suburbs or outer edges of Little Rock, they can do native. But I'm a little bit further out from the edge of Little Rock. I have 2.5 acres, but most of that is woods and not suitable for pollinators, but suitable for insects that eat leaves, that then get eaten by birds, that then and use those to feed their nestlings. So what Lynn Foster and I are trying to do is help people realize the value of trees as caterpillar generators, I guess I'd say, and then use that to then foster birds. One clutch of chickadees takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get it from egg hatching to flying out of the nest box. So, you know, I think if you have woods, make them caterpillar havens. If you have only something in the sun, you know, then maybe you're talking more nectar plants. It varies a lot. So, and you don't have to have just one kind. You know, I have a mix of flowers, sunflowers, and woods with oaks and hickories and sweet gum and other kinds of trees.
Thank you. Pop quiz. So are there any native nitrogen fixing shrubs or trees that you would recommend other than New Jersey tea, wild indigo, redbud, and the locust?
My understanding is that red buds don't fixate nitrogen, even though they're in the pea family. You know, there's always those exceptions to the rule. I used to think that it did because it was in the pea family, but I learned not long ago that that's actually not the case. But so yeah, just because something is in the pea family, what I learned there is that we can't assume that it's going to fix nitrogen.
Usually when I plant some partridge pea when I think I'm having a nitrogen issue. There's another plant rattling around in my head, but I'll be darned if I can think of it right now when I'm on the spot, but I'll blurt it out here in a minute out of nowhere. So partridge pea is sort of my go-to. It's an annual, so if you need it to go ahead and start fixing nitrogen, you can allow it to do that. If you don't want it to seed off and make a big mess, you can come back and take the blooms off easily. And like I said, there's another one in there, and I've got a mental picture of the bloom, and I've got nothing for a name.
I have nothing to add to this, Leslie.
That's okay. Thank you.
There are.
I know. I was.
Go ahead.
No, it's okay, Eric. Go ahead.
I was just saying, there are, you know, if you're looking for trees, I mean, I would just, that's a little bit different, but I mean, there's plenty of herbaceous nitrogen fixing native plants, like Laurie had mentioned partridge pea, and then one you probably don't want though is tick trefoil, but I don't mind that so much because I can keep a little bit more of a wild yard. But that one is in the legume family as well, but probably not quite as popular. But yeah, I would just research online if you're looking for green manure or something like that. That would be something you could look into.
Excellent point. Thank you. So what type of routine maintenance, if any, is involved with a small native garden plot? So with larger acreages, they know that we use fire a lot to manage it. What do we do in these smaller areas?
Weed.
Right.
Weed, but my opinion here at school, what we teach our students is to start out with good infrastructure, just like you would if you were building a building or a road. So when we look at butterfly gardening, what we tend to think of or teach here on campus of good infrastructure would be no-till or low-till. So I do chemical management. I am a licensed pesticide applicator. I use a very small amount of a very narrow range of chemicals, but the right chemical and the right concentration and the right situation at the right time of year can make a huge difference in gardening. However, the way to prevent having to use that is to make sure that you don't have a lot of weedy stuff coming up. So my two main tips for starting that good infrastructure are, number one, you need a thick layer of newspaper, and then you need to put down good weed barrier. Somebody earlier was talking about solarizing. You can solarize first and then put down a couple inches of newspaper and then put down some weed barrier. I'm not talking about weed barrier from Walmart or Lowe's or even Home Depot. I'm talking about accessing a commercial landscaping vendor online and buying commercial grade landscaping cloth. As soon as you pull it out of a sack, is when it's delivered, you can tell that there's a very, very, very big difference between commercial grade weed barrier and what you would consider residential weed barrier. Those two things alone, whether you chemically manage or choose to do solarization to kill off the green manure on the soil surface, that will help keep the weeds down for a long while.
Go ahead, Janet.
I've never seen that commercial landscaping cloth. I think that would be good for me to look at. But I think one really good way to keep weeds down is to either plant the plants thickly or allow them to grow up. And if they shade out weeds, that can be a help. But unless you're made of money, and I'm not, you know, when you first start, you're going to have space between your plants. And you see pictures of some where there's lots of space and it's mulched between plants. But I don't think that helps you in the long run. Maybe the commercial landscaping cloth could let you do that, but I like to have it very thick of plants, and that helps keep the weeding down.
We do plant with space in between. We use landscaping cloth to establish where we have students putting in gardens here is where we had a full lawn before. So commercial landscaping fabric works great when you're competing with yard grasses. If I were to put in a butterfly garden in an open area where I was not competing against Bermuda or fescue, I might make different choices. I've not had to put in a garden that way. In those instances, I'm land managing, which is very different.
I want to add too that, you know, if it's the first year you put down some plants, you might want to make sure that they're getting watered during the dry summer months until they're established.
Mm-hmm.
But even if they're established, sometimes if you want blooms during those summer months, you may still need to water. If you don't water, they're not going to die necessarily, but they're not going to be as happy and might not bloom as much.
Yeah, I agree.
All excellent points. And I think the most difficult part about, you know, designating the two separate habitat panels, it really comes down to, you know, if people want a more formal garden or if they're okay with a messier, I like to call them pollinator plots or pocket prairies. And, you know, if you kind of are okay with the messier plantings, then you don't need to do the, you know, the weed barrier and everything. And, you know, like Janet mentioned, having the plants kind of shade the weeds out. But again, when you're just getting started, it really just kind of depends on personal preference. So I love the answers to the questions. Thank y'all. So the next question is, what are the best products to use for pest insects in the garden that are safe for birds and pollinators? I was overrun with armyworms, squash bugs, stink bugs, hornworms, and the vine borer.
Well, I can tell you for the vine borer, your best bet to combat that is to elevate your vines and not have them on the soil. And I know that sounds super obvious, but that I've lost a lot of pumpkin plants to vine borers. And the only thing I found that really helps is to keep everything up, even if that just means setting the lid from a 5-gallon plastic bucket or those red French fry baskets. Sometimes you can get 4 for $1. Just anything to elevate that plant material up off of the soil surface, because when you've got that plant laying directly on the soil surface, you're inviting the larva to come out of the soil or signaling to the moth to come lay. It kind of depends on where in the life cycle you're getting attacked from. Squash bugs, the best way to control those is to catch them before they lay, and squashing them with your fingers is mechanical removal is about the best thing I know for that. A diatomaceous earth will work on the adults, but not on the eggs. So there again, you're having to break the life cycle, like with most insect pests. You attack the life cycle, you can control the adult, which is what's generally eating on your plant material. So the things that I use for chemical management are diatomaceous earth, I will use neem oil if I have to. That's my last resort, or insecticidal soap. The key to working with insects and controlling them is to not overuse the same thing a whole bunch of times. Yeah, I got to keep changing it up. And for me, I save neem oil as my big guns. When the insecticidal soap, DE, nothing else is working, then I'll go ahead and pull out some neem. It will also work as a soil soak and kind of help control things in the soil. But you got to do your research, because not every plant can have every chemical. Some plants won't tolerate neem.
One insect that I see a lot of people worry over are the yellow aphids that get on milkweeds. I just leave them because if you, in my experience, if you leave them, you will eventually get tiny, I think they're wasps, that come and parasitize the aphids. And so if you look at the aphids and you see some little round brown blobs, that means they've been parasitized, and people call them mummies. And if you leave them, they will eventually give you a new generation of wasps, and they will attack the other aphids. And I haven't had problems with aphids on milkweed if I leave them for the wasps.
Yeah, my experience has been pretty much the same there, Janet. Except I've had ladybugs come and eat my aphids off my milkweeds and my goldenrods. Last year, I've had my goldenrods are covered in aphids, and I just was freaking out at first, and then gave it a week or so, and then next thing I know, I got ladybugs out there gobbling them up. So it's just kind of giving the ecosystem some time to adjust and get it on its own. But,
I have read, Eric, that the yellow aphids on monarchs can be distasteful to ladybugs.
Okay. I think I have more of the orange reddish aphids on mine.
Yeah.
I'm not an entomologist, so anything I speak on any pests, I'm really I could be wrong, but so I'm just but this is just what I've seen in our house.
I hope you're not accusing me of being an entomologist.
I would be willing to bet you know more than I do.
I had to consult at a nursery who could not tolerate the oleander aphids, and they also wanted to help, not kill their pollinators. They like having the butterflies come through, even though it means sometimes they have to set a parsley plant aside until the swallowtails are done with it. So in situations like that, I don't mind going and consulting and trying to help out at all. And so this is what we came up with, because moths feed at night and butterflies feed during the day. Here in Northwest Arkansas, so I'm at Northwest Arkansas Community College in Rogers, Bentonville area. In the summer, if you go out about 6 o'clock with some pretty heavy soap in a spray bottle, you can get the aphids. They actually had an invasive aphid that came out of Florida that came up on some tropical plants is what started this whole thing. So you can kill any aphid I've come in contact with fairly easily just with soap and water. But I also don't worry about the oleander aphids unless they get so thick that they're starting to make the tips of my plants look, like they need watered. And when they start looking like they're dry and I know that I've watered them, then it's probably from the aphids getting out of control. And then I will go ahead and soap. But I'll maybe once a season if I have thick oleander aphids. They're symbiotic, so they're pretty good at handling themselves.
Great points. I would also encourage anyone who's worried about, insect pests to look into IPM strategies, it's the integrated pest management system. And remember, so if you're doing a pollinator garden and those insects are a little different and, the oleander aphids, you want things to be eating your plants. You're contributing back to the ecosystem. So it's very important to research, if you do decide on using chemical means, you want to make sure that any pesticide that you use is non-systemic, so it doesn't get taken up by roots and affect non-target insects. The problem with most insecticides is that They're not selective. It's very broad spectrum, so it will kill any insect that consumes it. So it's just important to kind of remember that. But, you know, different tools. There's another question about, does landscaping cloth impact soil microbial health?
I was wondering if somebody would come around to that, because I actually used to work in microbiology before I started doing land management. So yes, it can, because to a certain degree you are cutting off, especially if you're going to solarize first, you're cutting off light, oxygen, and then you're raising the temperature above what most of those microbes are ready for. I've handled that a couple different ways. First of all, when you replant that area, you're going to replant that area with a plant plug that has more than likely already have some inoculum in it, number one. Number two, soil microbes are super good at staying alive or repopulating if you kill them off. So if you solarize and you solarize really, really, really well, you're only gonna solarize the top 1.5 to 2 inches is what I say. If you get a great solarization system going on, maybe a little bit deeper, but the top 4 inches of soil are where typically what we think of vegetables and cultivars live. And then all tall grass, prairie plant, native plants, those guys are going down, you know, really deep into the soil. So that soil will recover. Yes, you probably are going to do a little bit of microbial damage. You can get some inoculum, go out and dig a little bit of dirt with permission from a native prairie site, or just be patient. Be patient. Be patient takes you a long way with native plant gardening, pollinators, all of those sorts of things, just as Dr. Lanza was bringing about earlier with the mummification of aphids. It takes 3 to 5 days for those plants to start kicking out enough of a biochemical message and the bugs to pick it up to know to come help that plant that is in distress. So I'm not a patient person, but plants and bugs will certainly make you learn to be patient.
A term that's been used here a lot, and I think should be explained, you might be the best person to explain it, Laurie, is solarization. What do people have to do to solarize an area and get the weeds out?
Solarization here on the NWACC campus is something that happens. We aren't solarizing this year because we're in a pandemic, but if I was going to solarize this year, I would have gone out in maybe August and picked where I was going to solarize. I like to do it in the winter because I want my soil to be ready by June or July, unless it's just a place that is thick with hard to kill things. So what I would do, I would go out and I would take a weed eater. I always talk with my hands. You guys can't see that. I weed eat the soil, the grass. I try to scalp it as close as I can to the soil surface. And then I would take black plastic, the heaviest, thickest black Visqueen I could get my hands on, either free or in my budget, and lay that black cloth down. And then you weight it down as heavily as you can, or stake it. In Northwest Arkansas, the pins that you put with landscaping timber aren't heavy enough. I have to use landscaping bricks or something heavy to keep that soil down, because we have a lot of wind. We're on the plateau here. So the sun heating up that black plastic will go through and kill off a lot of the grasses and the roots that are left in the soil. It will kill back a lot of the insects that have, and I don't mean pollinators. Our pollinators aren't necessarily laying their eggs in the soil. But the vine borers are something that's actually really good to be handled through the solarization. The heat from the sun is going to hit that black plastic. It's going to heat up all the roots and the grass and the dirt that's there, and you're going to have a much better substrate to come back and start planting in the spring, or soil conditioning in the spring for a fall planting. I find myself often saying, it kind of depends on what your end goal is. What are you going to do? Where do you want to start? Everything in habitat management is pretty fluid. There are some hard and fast rules, but there's a lot of ways to be flexible to make management, be it a small garden or 16 acres, you know, sort of fit in with your timeline as well.
I think I've also read that clear plastic can work well in the summer because it'll act like a greenhouse and really heat the soil. What do you know about that, Laurie?
I have not tried solarization with clear at all. I think it's certainly worth a try in the summer. I've just never done it because of the way that we run our projects and my life sort of to a certain degree, semester by semester. That's just the way it is in higher ed. And summertime is not when I'm prepping gardens. I don't have any students here in the summer. So summertime's when, you know, that's heavy labor for me.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried to get rid of a big patch of fescue. This was early on. I was just experimenting with some clear visqueen. With that, my experience was that it did not do anything to the fescue. I suspect it might have even created like a little mini humid habitat for it because it seemed to do just fine. That's just fescue though. So but I have read that, yeah, that you could use the clear as well as the black, but that the black is best is what I've read.
Awesome. Thank you. We did have another note, just thanking you all about the information about the oleander aphids on milkweed. I will note that I'm like Janet, I just leave my oleander aphids. You know, I feel like the natural predators kind of wiped them out before I ever had to intervene. So I'm with the patience that Laurie talked about. So the next question that we have is, when is the best time of year to plant a native garden? So either from seed or from plugs, or just kind of give your perspective on that.
I answered first a whole bunch. So Eric or Janet, why don't you guys take it?
Well, I spoke already. So Janet, I'll let you take it first and I'll follow up.
Oh, you guys are generous. I personally, I've read that planting in the fall is a great time because it gives the plants time to establish their roots. On the other hand, you often don't have plants available in the fall. You know, Pine Ridge Gardens, who was mentioned earlier today, and I think is a great place to get plants. They have a lot more plants available in the spring than they do in the fall. So there's trade-offs there. Something that that I think people can do pretty easily is grow their own seeds. And I have not been very successful growing seeds in little peat pots. And it's not because of the technique, it's because I don't take care of them well enough. What I have found is that winter sowing works really well. And that doesn't mean winter S-E-W, it means winter S-O-W. And you get plastic containers, gallon milk jugs or iced tea jugs work pretty well. You poke holes in the bottom, cut about halfway up, not all the way across, but enough so that you can open it and you could have a lid, fill the bottom with soil, and leave the top off. But plant your seeds in January and just leave them there. If it's really, really dry, you can add some water. But if you have holes in the bottom and it rains, you won't get too much sogginess. Just leave them outside. It fits me because it doesn't require daily attention. And I did write a little one-page thing about that once upon a time. And Leslie is going to post some resources that I put together for this panel. If you want, Leslie, I could send you my winter sowing page, but it's very easy to Google winter sowing, SOWING, and find out how to do it. And there's lots of images on the web and videos about how to do it. So if you can get seeds of what you want, you can get a lot of plants at one time.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of winter sowing myself when it comes to seeds, because one thing it does is for those species that need that cold stratification, you're doing it naturally rather than having to do it in a refrigerator.
Right.
So yeah, sometime in early winter, put seeds down. I would just warn you, that's also the time of year when birds may be looking for more seed out on the ground. So, I mean, depending on how you're doing it, the way I do it, I tend to just kind of cast it out after, well, first I'll kind of scrape the ground to kind of disturb a little bit of that top ½ inch of soil, put the seed out, and then I'll usually cover it. Depending on the species, if it's a species that would normally grow in a forest, I'll just pull back the leaf litter, put it under that, and then put the leaf litter back on top of it. Otherwise, covering it with some sort of straw or grass or something would help prevent as many of them from being eaten by the birds. I did seed a part of my property, spent like a few hours on it one weekend, and then went to work Monday, and my wife called me and told me I had 50 different birds out there just having a little buffet. So if they only waited a year, it would have been fine. So, I mean, that's just one thing to consider in the winter when you're putting seed out is, that is a wildlife food source, which is one of the reasons why we're growing native plants. But, I know we'd rather them wait until, those seeds can germinate and turn into another plant that will produce seeds each and every year.
But if you do it in containers that have sort of lids, not the lid that goes on top of a milk jug, but the top half of the milk jug, then you can keep the birds away from it, but then you have to transplant them.
Laurie, do you have anything to add?
Oh, I'm the opposite. I do everything real controlled, stratify in the refrigerator. Everything's, 3 seeds per cell in forestry management cells. So I can answer lots of questions about a very specific way, but what Eric and Janet are telling you is just fine for the at-home gardener. We're an academic institution here and try to teach students protocols and how to write and all kinds of things. So
I think the important thing is finding what works for you and your
Yeah.
lifestyle, like for me, I'm better off if I can just go out there, work a day, put it all down, and then hope for the best in a few months. So if it requires, constant maintenance, I might be a little less likely to stay on top of that.
All excellent points. I think that a key highlight for our listeners is that, there isn't one set answer for any situation. It is dependent a lot on the habitat area that you have, so your soil type, your moisture, your sunlight, and, your funds and the amount of time that you're looking to spend. So I think that, everyone's asking the right questions. We have a really great question. So what is the difference between xeriscaping and native gardening?
Well, xeriscaping is going to be a lot of those, xerophytes? Remind me, are those the ones that prefer like a drier environment?
Yeah, that's dry.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of our native species that are going to like a dry environment are going to be some glade species. Especially most of our glades are going to be pretty dry, desert-like. So I would go for some of those. But all native plants aren't necessarily xerophytes. Some of them like wet feet. Others like, moderately wet to moderately dry feet. So.
Awesome. Did Laurie and Janet, did you have anything to add?
I think he did fine.
yeah, I thought that was extremely succinct answer.
I love it. Okay. So another question that we've gotten a few different ways, so I'll try to kind of mush them together. So are there any native plant species that you would not recommend? So you would avoid for either a small acreage planting, or, could you recommend species that you wouldn't recommend you know, because they're not very well behaved and they take over a garden.
Green ash. One thing, the emerald ash borer moth, is one reason people are discouraging green ash, but green ash can be, some would call it invasive, other prefer to use the word invasive for exotic species and would refer to it as aggressive. But I've been in some places where green ash is just, you know, it's like a Bradford pear, which just takes over. It's like the one tree species for a good wide area. So that's one I would not recommend.
Leslie, would you repeat the question? I had stuff going on my phone and the computer screens. Would you please repeat it?
You're fine. I'll try to do a better job. So could you name a native species that you would not recommend to be used in a garden setting or a small planting? Because I'm assuming because it will take over or something like that.
I think I'm just going to echo Eric. For me, there's not one specific one that I just would say don't plant it. There are plants I would say not to plant in certain habitats and to absolutely plant in others based on the other things we've talked about. Soil pH, light requirements, soil type, and your end goal. What is your end goal as the gardener? You know, what do you want to attract? Are you attracting monarchs? Or are we talking about a situation more like Dr. Lanza was speaking of, where yes, we want to attract the pollinators, but we're attracting pollinators because we also want to make a food source for birds. So
there are ways to find out whether species are aggressive and take over. Lissa Morrison is somebody from the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. And she's got lists of species. I don't know if she's got a list on the web of misbehaving species, but she has a list of well-behaved species. I have been researching on the web plants and the conditions they like and what pollinates them and what eats, you know, whether they're moths and butterflies that eat them. And this is not a resource that's available for anybody else to use at this point because it's so early in development. But I will know plants that some people say are invasive and you don't want to use them in a small home garden. But colonizes, naturalizes, aggressive, those are all terms that can be associated with plants that can potentially take over.
Yeah, and Lissa, that list of hers is on Botanical Gardens website. And Lissa is also the vice president of the Ozark chapter of Wild Ones and is the chair of our site visit committee here. So she's one of the ones that goes out and advises homeowners in the Northwest Arkansas region on native plants that they could use in their homes. So I highly recommend reaching out to Lissa Morrison.
Excellent question. So while I am trying to piece together we just got a new one. So can restored prairie vegetation get to a climax state and not require further maintenance or just minor maintenance? I'm assuming that he means in a, kind of a messier planting setting.
Would that be a better question for the large scale habitat panel? Unless, Jen or Laurie have anything to add.
yeah, I can a little bit, but like I said, I'm only comfortable speaking about maybe 20 acres max, and that's far more than what I typically manage. So the short answer would be in Northwest Arkansas, no, there's not really a climax or a point that you hit where you don't have to do maintenance on a prairie restoration, because we're on the edge of the prairie biome. So where eastern deciduous forest breaks way to the Great Plains and the prairie. And that means that you constantly have woody encroachment, which is what fire, prescribed burn, helps keep in check. there's other benefits besides just keeping woody species in check, but that for me, particularly in a land management situation, that's one of the most valuable things besides just returning carbon to the soil and waking up some of my seed bank. But really it's keeping the woody encroachment down.
I'd also like to add, we can pose the same question to the large acreages habitat panel. I know that those panelists are probably itching to answer, but I would like to say that there really are no magic seeds, or there's no magic state or climax state that you're going to be able to plant monarch and pollinator habitat and not require at least some maintenance. It kind of depends on your personal definition for maintenance and then minor maintenance, just because, like Laurie mentioned, woody encroachment, also grasses are naturally dominant. These systems, need periodic disturbance so that they can, maintain their openness. So another question that we have, so how important is plant diversity in small area plantings, or how many species of flowers is enough for my pollinator garden?
Well, one thing to think about is in the way you combine the plants, there are species that are used to relying on the plants around them to hold themselves up, especially some that get very tall. So that might be something to consider as the structure of your habitat you're creating, and whether those species will be there for the others. So I read this article not long ago. I'm thinking more about it as plant communities versus planting individual species, and how these species like to kind of go together in the wild. And I wish I could speak more on specifics, but maybe perhaps Janet or Laurie can, but I'll pass it to one of them.
Remind me of the question, please, Laurie.
No, you're fine. So how important is plant diversity in these small area plantings? So how many species do you recommend for a garden?
I don't think the important thing is the number of species. I think what's really important is that you have something. If we're talking about pollinator gardens where you're going to have bees and butterflies, what's really important is that you have flowering for the entire season. You need things very early in spring, all the way till this time of year. And there's no plant basically that does that unless you're talking an annual. And even then, probably not. Won't go the whole season. So you need a series of plants that will cover the season. Something I was surprised to learn recently that's really important for early season bees is willow. And that if you plant a willow, and black willow is one of the ones that's occurs in Arkansas, that's a really good thing for early bees. When you get to the end of the season, asters, goldenrods, those are things that really help pollinators at the end of the year. Leslie, can I respond to a question that I see on the chat that you haven't asked about, and that is about evergreen plants in the winter? I've fallen in love with a tree called devilwood, and it's an understory evergreen broadleaf species, and so it gives you color in the winter. Some of the hollies do, but there are also deciduous hollies that drop their leaves. Another understory shrub is Illicium, Illicym, or something like that, wild anise, ANISE. And that's pretty much evergreen in the winter, at least here in central Arkansas. I don't know up where you guys are, Laurie and Eric.
I think devilwood we don't have up here in the Ozarks, but yeah, it is native to southern,
Mhm.
south of here.
What about wild anise? Do you know that?
I'm not certain. What's the scientific name on that? I can look it up.
Elysium, ILLI maybe.
Let's see.
I don't think it's native up here. I saw something about it just the other day. I had not, I don't, I'll
Is it
probably
the
might be wrong.
Elysium florinatum?
That's Floridanum is the red colored one, and that's I think native to Florida, but there's another Elysium.
I'm showing here Elysium parviflorum has it shown in Florida, and then the Floridanum being southeastern United States, like heavily in South Mississippi, South Alabama.
Hmm.
So it could probably do well in southern Arkansas, because I see, also a little bit in North Mississippi too.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who are kind of new to the native plant game, the resources that they're talking about, there's different tools that you can look up to see where a native plant is native to. So just because a plant is native to Arkansas does not mean that it's found statewide. So in the email that I send out these resources that they've mentioned, I can also link, one of my favorites is BONAP.
That's what
Do
I was
you three
using.
have any other recommendations?
Yeah, I use BONAB. Looks like that was also just suggested in our chat. And then plants.usda.gov, which is also suggested here in the chat. It'll have a range map, but it's not as accurate as BONAB. So.
Yes, excellent point. I just saw that.
Both of those are
Go
on.
ahead, Jen.
Both of those are BONAP and the USDA are in the handout that I prepared and sent to Leslie.
And sometimes, like, I think maybe in the case of Elysium, what it looks like, I don't know this for a fact, but, it just may be a geographical feature like the Mississippi River that prevented it from spreading. So while it may still do fine here and still serve some of the local pollinators, even if it isn't, native to Arkansas, it still may do just as fine and be beneficial to use it.
Wonderful. So another question, so we're going to try and wrap it up here so that we leave a little bit of time at the end so you can list your contact information. So I'm going to combine two kind of heavy questions. So are local ecotypes important? Why or why not? And also, how do you feel about cultivars of native species?
I think ecotypes are very important because these are the variants of the species that are adapted to the soil conditions and specific climate of the region, such as the Ozarks or southern Arkansas, in which they're evolving. So they're going to be better able to handle those conditions if they're replanted in the same region that ecotype is from versus one that's dramatically different. Like cattails, broadleaf cattails, those grow in South Louisiana. They also grow in Alaska. But if we took a Louisiana ecotype, try to plant it in Alaska, where it might be trying to flower, too soon, whenever the, Alaskan ecotypes might flower later. That's often a difference you see in latitude gradient is some flowers at higher latitudes will flower later because they're waiting for that last frost to end. So if you have a southern ecotype planted in the north, then it may flower, then freeze, and then the flower's dead.
My opinion on this, and earlier today, there was a lot of emphasis on locally sourced seeds and plants. And I think that is a fabulous ideal. I don't think at the current time that those kinds of seeds and plants are easily available to most homeowners. And so I think you're left with a dilemma of no plants until 5 years from now when we have seeds and plants locally sourced, or use something that comes probably not from Alaska, but maybe Missouri or Oklahoma. So I think there's some trade-offs there. I would like to hear somebody really knowledgeable debate the issue about how we should go.
Yeah, and I agree. I think, like right now, not everything is available. So if you are going to reach a little bit outside of our ecoregion, then like Janet's saying, somewhere like Missouri, Oklahoma, where the climate's going to be, close to ours, that's going to be better. You're going to have a much better time getting it to grow for one thing, and then it's going to be much easier to integrate it into the local ecosystem.
With regard to the question about the cultivars, there's sort of some similar dilemmas there. Some cultivars, i.e. ones that maybe are double flowers, you really may not want those, because double flowered things sometimes don't have nectar. Sometimes they don't produce nectar. Sometimes there are so many petals, it's hard for the pollinator to get in there. You'd probably want to avoid them. Other cultivars have reddish leaves, and the biochemistry of them appears to be different. And so if you're trying to feed caterpillars, that may not be ideal either. On the other hand, there are some cultivars that are good. I referred to Lissa Morrison a while ago, and I know that on her list of well-behaved plants, she specifically mentioned two cultivars. One is an aster, Radon's aster. Eric, do you know that one, or Laurie? And she says it's a great plant and good for pollinators.
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I'm sure, yeah, probably right.
Yeah, so, if you can get the species, that's probably better than a cultivar, except in a few isolated cases.
Right, I think, was it Mount Cuba Center that's doing a lot of research on cultivars versus their wild varieties, and kind of taking surveys of the insects and pollinators that are on each one. And they found that our cultivated blueberries actually support more insects than the wild blueberry variety. So that's one of those instances, like Janet was saying, when we've actually been able to make some improvements. But there's also just many improvements, or quote unquote improvements, that we've made that have not been good for the pollinators. They may look pretty, but it's not what we're going for here when we're trying to plant habitat. So
who's doing that research, Eric?
I'm sorry?
Eric, who's doing that research?
Mount Cuba Center, and I think Doug Tallamy also.
Okay.
Yeah, Mount Cuba Center up in that area. But yeah, you could also, what was I going to say? I had one more point. To recognize a cultivar or nativar versus the native or the wild variety, say, it'll have like a name in quotations right after the scientific name. Say, like Janet was giving an example of one of the asters. So if it, I've seen like a cultivar or nativar of buttonbush called fiber optic. So if you see the name, was it Cephalanthus occidentalis, then fiber optics, then okay, that's not the true, I'm trying to think of the right term, the non-cultivar, that is the nativar.
I just have an interesting story to share right at the end of this, because I'm not a purist. Like I said, we keep about 10% cultivars. And I really like trumpet vine, but I'm having a really hard time getting it to establish in my yard. So my husband, for Mother's Day, bought a cultivar, and he bought a mandevilla. And it's red, and it went crazy, and it was beautiful on the deck. And about the time the spice-tail butterflies, I have sassafras in my yard, about the time they started getting really, really thick, I noticed when I walked out on my back porch every night that I had little butterfly bottoms sticking up out of the mandevilla blooms. And it took me a couple days of watching to see if what I had a hunch was happening. But those spice bush swallowtails really want the nectar down inside the mandevilla, but their hind wings are not shaped for them to always come back out of that bloom very well. So I planted a non-native cultivar that made me very happy. And then I spent the rest of the summer pulling butterflies out of the trumpets because they are not butterfly friendly. And even though I dearly love that plant and red is my favorite color, I won't plant it again. I'm just going to have to figure out how to get the trumpet vine to go. So the reason I told that story was because even if you find a cultivar or a nativar, it still doesn't mean, even if it plays nice in our yard, it doesn't mean it's going to play nice with the pollinators. So you always got to keep a watchful eye out on what you're doing when you're trying to foster things in your area, in your space.
2 plants I'd suggest that you might try, Laurie, is crossvine. Bignonia, I think, is the genus, but it only blooms in April, May, about the time the hummingbirds come back. But also the native red honeysuckle maybe would make you happy.
Yeah, I've gotten Asian honeysuckle. We've gotten that out of the yard, but I'm not having good luck with the other stuff. And I think it's because I only have about 2 acres of yard and all the rest of it is forest or ravine. It's a really neat place to live, but it's not easy gardening.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I would love to thank each of you for lending your expertise and answering all of these questions so wonderfully. So we're out of time. We can't do any more questions, but really quickly, beginning with Laurie again, if you'd like to just say your contact information. Of course, if people have already gotten my email address, please feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with any of our panelists. So Laurie, go ahead.
Okay, my name is Laurie Scott, SCOTT. My email is lscott and then the number 3, lscott3 at NWACC.edu.
Contact information, I'll give you my email. It's eric.fuse. They left the E out my name on the slide there. So FUSELIER at craftontull.com. That's CRAFTONTULL, one word, .com.
Okay, I'm Janet Lanza, and my email address is X like Xena, warrior princess, Lanza, LANZA, at UALR.edu. And I want to say that even though it's been virtual, I've been very happy to meet you, Laurie and Eric.
Yes, it was lovely to meet you too.
You too, Janet. So happy to hear about the great things that you and Lynn are going to start doing down there too.
Well,
Yeah.
we hope.
And all the people we can't see, I hope you guys learn some stuff instead of just listening to us yak at you for an hour.
I agree.
All great feedback coming from the comment section. So Eric, I apologize. That was my mistake. I'm going to blame autocorrect, but I think I'm just placing the blame. So I apologize for the misspelling.
I'm used to it, so no apologies necessary.